Hey everyone, so this week I thought I would take a look at a new series from A&E called Cults and Extreme Beliefs, which is hosted by Elizabeth Vargas, a former investigative journalist from ABC who is now working for A&E directly. And they've put this series together. I'm not sure how many episodes it's going to go for, or are they planning on more than one season. So far, as of the time I'm making this video, there have been 3 episodes that have come out in the series so far. And all of them focusing on an individual cult and a survivor story from someone who was involved in that destructive cult. The first episode involved Xenu. The second episode involved the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the third episode was the Children of God, or the Family International as they are called now. They tried to sort of rebrand themselves in the 80s to get past some of the criminal activity they were involved in the 70s and 80s, which is what the majority of the show from Cults and Extreme Beliefs focuses on, because the survivor story from the person who was in Children of God and the subject matter of it concentrates on some of the sexual abuses and nonsense that was going on in that group because of its founder, who was an absolute pedophile and disgusting individual. Okay, so I thought I would give some thoughts and feedback on the show so far, what I think about it. Obviously, I was involved with Scientology in the Aftermath, which is Leah Remini's show, also on A&E. And one of the producers from that show, from I believe the first and maybe second season, is one of the producers on this show. The style and format of this show is similar in many ways to Scientology in the Aftermath. The graphics are different and that sort of thing, but the framework of the show is somewhat similar. But each episode only gives, 45 minutes to each cult. So you're, by necessity, only going to get so much information that they can pack in during that time. I thought I might talk about some of the pros of what I see in the series and then some of the cons of what I see. The focus of each episode is on a specific survivor or former member of each of these groups. And they do a very good job of focusing on their story, giving the background, how they got involved in the group in the first place, what they experienced in the cult, at least, some of the highlights, I guess you could say, of some of the abuse that they experienced. Again, in such a short format show, it's going to be impossible to give the full story. I've done interviews on my channel with former Scientologists, and it takes hours to get the entire story from beginning to end of everything that happened to them and all of the things that motivated them and drove them to stay in the group, and all of the ups and downs that they experienced and contacts that they had with the leadership, with other members. I mean, these are chunky stories, so by necessity they are condensing this down into the highlights of the story, and they tend to focus mostly on the abusive behavior involved with these groups. There is a lot of emotional impact as a result. There's a lot of appeal to emotion in the show, and it works, because they definitely have selected people to speak on the show who have a tragic story to tell. And that's not uncommon for members of destructive cults. That's, of course, why we call them destructive cults. It gives a sampling of some of the beliefs and the ideas and the leadership of the groups, who is involved, how are they establishing, how is the group established, a basic rundown of how the group operates, but very basic, very, very skeletal framework of that. And some idea of the leadership, when it comes to Xenu, for example, in the first episode, they go into some detail about Keith Renier, or Renier, I think is how you say his name, and but they didn't really give a whole lot of information about where he came from or something like that, but kind of his background, how he started the group. With the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have a council of people. So you don't have a single leader, you have the leadership, meaning, being this council of elders. And that was kind of interesting, learning about some of that. But I'm going to swing right into some of the cons now, or some of my criticism of the show, because it ties in so much with those 2 points that I thought were okay about what the show was doing. First off, and probably my biggest problem with the show is it jumps right into the survivor story with Nexium, and it jumps right into, okay, this is a cult, and they did all these things, and isn't this horrible, and this extremism, but they fail to first establish a baseline of what is a cult. This is a very controversial word. This is a word that has a lot of baggage connected to it. I have, on my channel, chosen from the very beginning to focus in on destructive cults, because the word cult all by itself doesn't necessarily, by definition, imply or connotate that you're talking about a destructive group. There are many groups in the world that could be called cults, which are not necessarily destructive cults. And so we use the term destructive cult very advisedly. And in fact, when I was a Scientologist, we used to joke about the word cult and admit freely, absolutely we're a cult. I would say to people, yeah, we're a cult. So's the Catholic Church, if you use the dictionary definition of it. So what's the big deal, right? Mainstream religions, they're all cults. And of course, I get comments about that on my channel all the time. But I think what is really being meant there is a destructive cult, where you're talking about a group that preys on its members, and the relationship between the leader and founder is an abusive relationship. And that's key to understanding what cults are all about. Discuss this at length on my channel, so I won't go into more detail on it in this review, except to say that if this show is going to call itself Cults and Extreme Beliefs, it would make sense that they would start, and I think an entire episode could have been devoted to this very easily, to lay out what is a cult, or what is a destructive cult? What is extremism? What are extreme beliefs? How do you define that? And why do you define it that way? There are two consultants that are used on the show. Janja Lalich, who I have had on my podcast, who was literally the source person for me of the definition and characteristics of a destructive cult. She does a wonderful job on the show. She's featured in the first two episodes. And Stephen Kent from the University of Alberta in Canada is a sociologist and professor there, and has done, his life work has been studying cults. He is featured in the third episode, and I'm not sure whether he'll be in the next ones or how that's going to roll out. But one of the cons I felt in the show is if you're not going to do a whole episode to define what is a cult, what is extremism, how does this manifest in the world, and believe me, it would be easy to fill an hour with just that information. If you're not going to do that, then when you bring on the consultants, and they are both featured in tandem with the survivors, they're in the same room, they're talking, they mention some things. Janja mentions cognitive dissonance. Stephen Kent mentions extreme belief, and they talk about some of the consequences and manifestations of this. They really should have featured them more. They're really not utilized enough in the show to give context to the story that's being presented. They throw some things out, but like when Janja mentions cognitive dissonance, they don't define it. They don't talk about how it's, the discomfort, the dissonance, the noise that's created in a person's head due to conflicting ideas. That's the cognitive part. She mentions this phenomenon, and I'm sure when she was in the studio and they were talking about this, she probably did a championship job defining it, because she's very good at that sort of thing, but they didn't feature it in the show. So I thought the editing was a little too tight when it came to the use of the cult consultants. They got some really good people on, and they could have utilized them a lot more. Also, while I mentioned as one of the pros of the show is that they mention a sort of summary or they go over some of the beliefs and structure of the cults, I think they actually should have spent more time on that. For example, the first episode on Nexium, they throw some terminology out. They mention that it's something that's done by people who are interested in improving themselves in the workplace. They offer seminars and workshops for people. It's not a religion. Nexium is not it's not covered by the First Amendment. It's not protected by religious protection, because it presents itself as a work-based improvement system. I guess that's how people get involved in NXIVM, but I'm a little disappointed to not be sure after watching a full hour or 45-minute episode on NXIVM. I'd like to know, more about it, and I'll have to go do my own research on that now. I think they could have covered that more thoroughly in the show. They focus a lot on the survivor story, but I think the editing could have been done just a little differently to cover more about the belief system. Same, Children of God covered more with the founder, whose name I forget right now, and some of the beliefs. It's obviously a Christian-based group, and it uses religious cloaking, really, for the founder of the group and his immediate family to prey sexually on children and the membership of the group. Pretty sick group, really. And then, of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they cover some of the beliefs, some of the structure of the leadership council, some of the beginnings of the group. But, again, I already had quite a bit of familiarity with the JWs because I've spoken quite a bit on my channel with Lloyd Evans, who is a former Jehovah's Witness. So maybe I didn't, need as much background with that show as I would have with, say, NXIVM or with Children of God. So I think they could be doing a bit more to concentrate on focusing on the group itself and how does it lure people in exactly? I think that would have been very useful information to have. They talked to the survivors about how they got in, and there's some concentration on that, but I think more would have been good. And also how they keep people in. Some of the structure, some of the beliefs, some of the tools that are used by these groups. I mean, Scientology has about 20 different mechanisms it uses to keep people involved. Love bombing, for example. Emotional blackmail, for another, with a disconnection. There's other things that they do to get and keep people involved in the groups. And different cults have different mechanisms. They don't all use the same things, right? So I think if they had talked about that a bit, I think the reason that's important is because it would have educated the viewers more about how these groups work, which is really important when you're watching these kind of shows, because if you don't get that across to the viewers, then they don't come away protected. They don't come away more knowledgeable about how to avoid falling into situations like that themselves. And I think that that is the most important part of putting this kind of information out there, is to sort of give people some kind of protective defense mechanism, measures that they can take to spot and stay away from these kind of groups when they come across them in their own life. So that's why I'm kind of harping on this point. And I might be being, of course, a little unfair with this business of covering the belief system because, as I mentioned, 45 minutes isn't enough time to cover, to give a real full coverage. I mean, Leah Remini has taken 2 seasons to discuss the basics and fundamentals of Scientology and how it's all put together. And she's really hardly, she's done more than scratch the surface for sure. You definitely get a deep dive into Scientology by watching, the first 2 seasons of her show. But it's taken 2 seasons to get that much coverage and show that much of the belief and structure. So I recognize that I might be being a little unfair in this. They have a lot of information to jam into a very small amount of time. So, obviously the emphasis in this show has been on more appealing to the emotional impact of the survivor story. And on that point, this is the final point I want to make as far as a critique of the show, is when the show is over, when you're done watching an hour on NXIVM or on JWs or whatever the content is, you are left with a feeling of outrage and upset. You feel very sorry for the survivors of these groups. You feel very mad and upset about the leadership of these groups, the way they take advantage of people, the way they destroy people's lives. but you're not really given anything to do or any direction to go as to where to focus that outrage. After you watch a show like this, you want to do something about it, you know? You want to like, hey, what can I do to help take these groups down, or to get the law involved or something? And of course, with NXIVM, we have the advantage of you know, the Keith Raniere is in jail right now, and Allison Mack is out on $5 million bail, according to the show. And this is right in the news right now. So this is a very hot topic, which is I'm sure why they led with it. But with the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have a group that has millions of members. It is legitimately a multi-million member group worldwide. And it's a destructive cult. There is no question about it. The Jehovah's Witnesses have covered up sexual predatory abuse of children in their groups for decades, and they are pretty unapologetic about it, which is pretty shocking considering how widespread the abuse is and how this has been shown and proven through investigation. I mean, Australia commissioned a royal inquiry, you know, formal body investigated the Jehovah's Witnesses. I think it was just last year. And they had tons of people coming forward and talking about, you know, the abuses that they'd experienced at the hands of this group. And yet the Jehovah's Witnesses are getting away with, you know, the leadership is saying, well, we never condoned or allowed any of this, yet they clearly did. So, you know, is there something the average viewer can do to contribute to moving the ball down the road to bring justice for the survivors of these groups and the victims of these groups? I don't know. Not based on the show, because there's nothing at the end to direct viewers as to where to go or what they could possibly do. Anything would be better than nothing, and nothing is really what's presented. So you're just left with this feeling of outrage, and you kind of have to go do your own research to figure out what to do. And I thought it would probably be helpful if you're going to do investigative journalism. This is being presented as, you know, an investigation into these groups. So I think, okay, we'll direct some attention then. All right, enough said about that. All in all, I'm very glad that this show is being aired. I'm very glad that the topic of destructive cults is a little hot right now in the media, at least on A&E and in other outlets that I've seen. I think the attention that's come to Scientology over the last many years has helped bring this to the light, because we know that there are, oh gosh, thousands. Steve Hassan has said 5,000 plus destructive cult groups out there in the world at large. Not all religious in nature. NXIVM, for example, not a religious group. I wish that point would have been highlighted also as part of this, but again, that goes back to defining what is a destructive cult, why is it destructive, what do they do that's so bad, how do you avoid, you know, the common pitfalls and tactics that they use to bring in new members or keep members on board. How did you know you're in a destructive cult? Because nobody joins a destructive cult on purpose. Nobody knowingly does that. So how would you recognize that you're in a group that's a high control totalitarian group? And what do you do if you find yourself in such a group? I think these are important points that could be mentioned or highlighted during the course of this show. And after the first 3 episodes, none of that has really been covered. So I'm happy that they're doing something to create some public outrage, to give a voice to the survivors of these groups. But I think if it could be tweaked just a little bit, I think they'd have a better show that would be more educational and more of a public benefit, rather than just creating a little bit of an outrage machine. So that all being said, I do recommend that you watch this show. It's on A&E. It can be seen on demand. That's on the ane.com website if you haven't seen the first episodes. And if you don't have access to A&E, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you as to how to see the show. Maybe it'll come up on YouTube or something like that, and you'll be able to see the episodes that way. I really don't know. But I do recommend watching it because it is educational for what it is presenting, and it is useful to know this information. So that all being said, I hope you guys, I hope you got something out of this critique and review. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.